Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to the Teach Different podcast. We are back in action here, and we have Mitch Conway with us. That's you, and we're totally excited about this. Mitch is one of our people that we worked with in the spring for our inaugural rollout of the Teach Different certificate pilot. He was a willing participant of that, and provided great feedback and had some really good experiences, I think, using the method. And we're just so happy to have him with us. We're going to ask Mitch a little bit about what he does, some of his background. He does some really interesting work with an organization out in Montana that he'll talk about. And then at some point, we'll roll into our quote. We got Henry David Thoreau today with a theme of civil disobedience. And that's like a little cliffhanger. We're going to leave that to a little bit into the conversation here. But Mitch, welcome. Please share who you are, who you work with, and your passion behind education. Take it away.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dan and Steve, for chatting with me today. Yeah, I really enjoyed doing the training in the Teach Different methodology in the spring, and it's just another way into doing philosophy in the classroom. And I think that's definitely my orientation. Whatever subject I'm teaching, I think I'm still a philosophy teacher. Um, I think even if I'm teaching math, I've found a way to that I'm actually teaching philosophy. But yeah, I guess, I have a difficult time accounting for my various activities as an educator because it's so various that it starts to feel absurd at a certain point. I'm listing things because I've operated in a variety of different contexts. But I think, I'll jump in with what I'm doing most recently. So most recently, my friend Dan here and our friend Marisa, we did a workshop here in Helena, Montana, with an organization called Merlin. And I've been working with Merlin for, I guess, 4 years, maybe 4.5. And so it's a community philosophy organization. And so one of the roles I've been in most consistently with that organization is facilitating monthly conversations. It's a group of adults who come in there of their own will to inquire into a question together to have a philosophical conversation. And me and Marisa would often co-facilitate, or if she wasn't available, I would facilitate, or if I wasn't available, she would facilitate. But often we would co-facilitate these community conversations. And that's definitely a fascinating dynamic, just to be like, okay, some people know each other, some don't know each other, but we're talking about really, really deep matters that hopefully people really care about. Um, and I guess, among my other activities, I've taught philosophy with quite young children, like 4 to 7. I've taught philosophy in college here in Montana at Carroll College, taught introductory philosophy courses. And I've been an educator in an agile learning center here called Cottonwood. And so I've been teaching a variety of subjects with that organization. I was just mentioning someone to last night. One of the first classes I did in an ongoing way with that group that they were very excited about was a death club. Now you'd be wondering, like, okay, that sounds sort of weird. What do you mean you were doing a death club with high school students, Mitch? But they wanted to talk about death and dying. And so, we went and walked around in graveyards and talked about what happens when we die. We went and, we met with a grief counselor. We met with a funeral director and had in-depth conversations, philosophical conversations with those folks. And that was just a fantastic experience. And the students were they chose it. So then they were very excited to be a part of it. But also I have a long background, you could say, as a theater educator. So I was working in theater for a number of years, and I've used a variety of different forms as a theater educator, and that definitely plays a major role in my general practice as an educator. Certainly in the philosophy classroom, I know I use those tools quite a bit. So that's an attempt to say something about my experience as an educator. I mean, I don't know if I address what you said about why I'm passionate about it. That's an interesting one. I guess whether or not it's warranted, I have the hope that the sorts of educational projects I'm involved with can be transformative in a personal way to the students or the people who are engaged with them. So oftentimes people think about schooling as something that's like, well, you want to acquire skills and then be able to acquire a job that those skills are involved in that, and that's sort of what your project is when you're involved in schooling. And I don't mean to devalue that or sort of neglect the fact that that's an essential element to good schooling, is preparing one for one's professional life. But I guess what I really connect to is when I uh, feel like someone is growing as an individual, and in the sense of their uh, becoming more authentic, or gaining self-knowledge, or jettisoning beliefs that are upon reflection not sufficiently founded, or those sorts of things. I like being involved in those sorts of processes, and I think that's why I'm in education.
That's great. And that's of any age, right? I mean, you appreciate that growth and development no matter what the age.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it was a pleasure, Mitch, to facilitate with you and Marisa and Helena. We had that really good conversation with a variety of aged people. And yeah, I saw you in action. You're quite impressive.
Kind of you to say.
Mitch, I have a question for you with regard to the different age levels. We were talking about this briefly before the podcast, the different age levels of people that get introduced to philosophy and what we might call adult-like conversations, some more sublime, serious conversations that rely on human experience at times to really appreciate, especially some of the moral questions, because the longer you have been on the earth, probably the more mistakes you've made, and also the more chances you've gotten to see what it's like to not make mistakes, or to see other people make mistakes. And that feeds into a lot of like really good ideas about philosophy, especially moral philosophy. Here's my question. Why do you think that many people think that younger people aren't really ready for deep thinking and philosophical, introspection? And I mean, people, they'll argue that a 17-year-old is too young, or a 16-year-old, because philosophy isn't in most high schools. Where do you see that sentiment coming from? And I'm sure you disagree with it like I do, but where does it come from?
Well, there could be a few different things going on with it with different people, but at least one idea, and I don't want to say this wrong and like it come out in a dismissive way, but when people get really, really elderly, it's like, well, what's their role in the community? And so maybe people start saying like, well, I get that they have a lot of experience of being alive, and so they're wise. So they're wise. Now, I'd be willing to say that sometimes people who are old are wise. And grant that. Okay, that's fine. But it's not a given that people who are older will be wise. I've seen, as I'm sure many of us have, many cases when that does not apply. When people haven't learned from their mistakes and from their experiences, they'll repeat the same mistakes over and over. And so uh, there's this problem where it's like, well, someone has more experiences, whatever that word means, right? More they've undergone, more like you said, Steve, more mistakes they've made, and hopefully had the opportunity to learn from. But because it's really hard to see when someone has developed as a person, like sometimes there's obvious transformations, right? But when we go through these little mistakes and we learn from them, it's hard to see when someone actually has like, oh, actually this person is, talking more politely to the person at the grocery store, whatever those little moments are, right? We don't get to see that. And so it might be a perceptual problem where it's like, well, how does someone think about the matters that are really challenging for us in depth, but more matters that are really challenging for about the human experience? And so it's likely that if someone has more experience, that they have more to say about that. But I don't, in my experience, that is not the case. That is not the case. And so I wouldn't even be willing to say that it's more likely that if someone is older, then they're going to do philosophy better. I wouldn't even be willing to give some sort of trend along with it, because I've talked with 4 and 5-year-olds who are very good at it. And that's because, and one reason that they can be quite good at it is because they're open-minded and because they're curious. And being open-minded and curious are essential to philosophizing, in contrast to advising on how to execute some particular task or how to accomplish something or so forth. And it tends to be the case, in my opinion, that it's harder for people as they age to remain open-minded and curious. And so, so I guess what I guess I'm coming around to saying in response to your question, Steve, is that why people would think that it's only those who are older can philosophize is actually a misunderstanding about what wisdom is. It's actually this assumption that, like, oh, what we do is we like accumulate a pile of experience and then we know things and then we're like doing better. But I think, whether fortunately or unfortunately, when it comes to some of these really deep matters, we don't know about them in a fundamental way. We actually can't know in a solid way. And accepting that we can't know is something that someone who's open-minded and curious about learning more is more likely to be able to acknowledge. Have I somewhat answered your question?
Yeah. So from what I'm hearing, Mitch, you're saying the dispositions of philosophy, the curiosity, the open-mindedness, the almost the advantage of not having a lot of experiences are actually dispositions of the youth more than the elderly.
Yes.
And so in that way, kids are more conducive to philosophical thinking. I love how you frame that. I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I teach it in high school, as you know, Mitch, and kids not only can think like this, they want to think like this. They do not have many jaded opinions yet. There's still a lot of hope and a lot of interest in shaping a new way of thinking in a high school classroom. There's that energy that you don't have in other groups. So 100% agree.
Has anyone, I don't, if I may interrupt just for a second, I don't have children, but I can say that, I assume that many people who've had children have noticed their kid get into something and then they're totally into it right away. And it's like this thing where they've like just started and then they're like, oh, this thing, and they're like all about that thing for like a long stretch of time, right? And so I think that sort of experience that many people have had can hopefully help people to see what you were just talking about, Dan, that actually young people can be like really change quite readily, right, in terms of what they're interested in, and so be more available to altering their judgments. Yeah. Anyways, just Steve, you were going to say something else.
No, yeah, I really enjoyed that too, because that would be wonderful. And that's an environmental thing. If you're around a teacher, if you're around an environment where that's brought out, wow, that increases the likelihood. My thought was this: experience doesn't equate with discernment. You can be experienced. You can live a long time with your eyes closed. So what I heard from you, Mitch, and the way I'm understanding it, I understand a lot of things through Plato's allegory of the cave, which talks about how all human beings are born and chained and are forced to look at the wall inside a cave that they don't even realize they're in. And there's a puppet show behind them and a fire burning. So they're watching all these artifacts on the wall. They think that's reality because people are talking behind them, but it's echoing off the wall. So they're not even getting the direct audio. Everything is distorted, but to them it's clear. You can live a life in the cave and still have no idea you're in a cave. Philosophy is all about the ascent out of the cave and a realization that there's another reality that you're not considering that gives you perspective of the reality that you were born in. So anyway, I'm just throwing that out because it's the gift that keeps on giving to me to understand philosophy. And I hope it made sense with your way of thinking of experience.
Well, if I think about the cave, I mean, it's really hard it's really complex the way it's utilized in the context in the Republic. So abstracting from that for a moment, at least taking the image on its own, we can think of it like, well, okay, I have lived a life based on certain assumptions or according to certain conventions, or I've taken certain opinions to be true, which are like those images on the wall, and the ascent is sort of the challenging of those presuppositions. But also, it seems and sort of like as though that happens one time, but it seems to me like a perpetual problem that we have, where we like establish conceptions or ways of understanding or something like that, and we have to like rework them and reassess them and like not get embedded in thinking that we grasp reality, because actually reality is really hard. You could say like, well, there's the superficial thing, there's like the deep in the cave shadow thing that we think is real, but it's in fact not real. But actually, and in the image, it's a very painful thing to see reality. And I think many of us have experienced, running up against reality in that sort of way. Ouch. Okay. And
which is
just
why we go back.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, Mitch. I
Okay.
think which is why we go back to the shadows. Plato talks about this leaving, coming back, leaving again. Like you're saying, it's not a one size fits all when you move to one side or the other. There's a dynamic there. So yes, I follow.
Yeah, and I know a cycle of it isn't in the way that Plato uses it, but in the sense that you describe, where it's like, well, you do go back down, right? Like someone who has gone on that journey of ascent out of the cave does go back down to bring other people, to like be like, hey, this is not, the right way to think.
There's something else.
The obligation, there's a duty to come back.
Yeah, I think so. I think so.
We could go off on that one. We got a Thoreau, though,
Yeah.
right? I mean,
that's great. Yeah. I mean, what do you say we do? Well, I mean, this kind of what we're talking about here of seeing the light, so to speak, and not being seduced by opinions and things that have not been thought about, and having lack of discernment. I mean, one of the hope for this method, this Teach Different method, is to help people engage with ideas in ways where they do open their mind up, and they're not immediately convinced of one way to think of the world. That they stop, they consider, they listen, and they maybe alter their opinions based on a new reality and new evidence. I mean, that's the hope, and I think it's a skill, it's a disposition that we try to engender with it.
I would love your read.
Yeah, I was just going to say, what is your read on that?
I would love to hear you describe the Teach Different method as in the way that it hopefully adds to philosophy. It just the way that you see it working, and what you usually don't see in many skills or tools that we're taught as teachers. I would love to hear your take.
Yeah, right on. I mean, I definitely agree with what Dan was just saying about this invitation to see things from multiple perspectives. I think that's something that's so in the first step, you have to like articulate what the quote's saying in your own way, right? And I think that's something so often people fail to do just in one-on-one communication, and then proceed from misunderstandings right there. It's like, oh, you said something and I think I know what you said, and so I'm responding, to what I think you said, and then we get in an argument because of something that's like, and then it comes down to you being like, oh, I didn't mean that. I meant this. Because I'm working with young kids at a camp right now, they're doing that all the time. It's like, oh no, you said that. I didn't say that to you. And it's like, oh, you were saying that. Okay. And so there is something healthy just to that act of rearticulation as an ongoing practice. It's like, okay, well, how would I say this for myself? Does that match? Does that match? What are the differences between these? And then again, this is what Dan was emphasizing. I think is like, well, okay, what's one way in which one could disagree with this? And I'm not saying how I disagree with it. I'm saying a way in which someone could disagree with it. I'm sort of like putting aside for a moment my own judgments about a particular matter at hand and saying like, well, what are the different ways in? And then I'm starting to think more, perhaps objectively, perhaps, like Dan said, multiple thinking things from different angles. And at that stage, usually in the process, from what I've done and what I've heard from you guys, is that you'll hear many different people's opinions about that. Well, you'll hear, okay, what are the different ways that you all posed that you would disagree with this? And so I'm already invited into thinking about things from many different viewpoints before delving into a place of inquiring. And the other thing I think is really, is not as often utilized as a tool in philosophy, but I think very much has a place, is personal narrative as a way into ideas. And it seems like that's a major consistent, even if not every time you address a quote, you're utilizing that as a component of your practice. It seems like a consistent component of your practice that you're inviting students to think through their personal experience as a way into the idea, and that there's something that grounds one in it, that you're not going to be as inclined to make arguments that don't really add up, that start to veer off into some theoretical rabbit hole that gets lost in something, if you've grounded it in your own problems. Like, okay, this proposition, or this problem as it's posed in a quote, has relevance to me, and I can resonate with that. And then, okay, what's going on with it? What are my judgments about it? So I think I've just been sort of, in restating components of the method, identified things that I think are not necessarily done in a consistent manner in classroom discussion. And the other one that I think is, really worth noting, and this is definitely prominent in the workshop that that Dan and Marisa and I did the other day, where when Dan was initially inviting people to, in his facilitation, he was very much encouraging people to talk to each other, rather than, one person says something, he responds, then he calls on the next person. And I think very often educators can fall into that trap of like, it has to always go through me. I'm the one who's mediating this whole thing. And by mediating, I mean that I respond to each thing and then every student is talking to me. But actually to create a space in which the students are thinking together, responding to each other, I think is a really, really significant difference in a classroom dynamic, and in a positive way.
That's
Really
great.
appreciated that. And
I think I hear Thoreau knocking at the door.
there you go.
Are we ready?
Ready.
Are we ready? Okay, let's.
Henry
That was
David.
it. Now, this is a longer quote, so we're going to say this multiple times to the listeners out there. I'll read it twice. It is not a man's duty, as a matter of course, to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous wrong. But it is his duty, at least, to wash his hands of it. One more time. It is not a man's duty, as a matter of course, to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous wrong. But it is his duty, at least, to wash his hands of it. Thank you, Thoreau, from his essay on civil disobedience, 1949, I believe. I got that date right. 1849.
Right before the Civil War.
And he's responding to slavery and the Mexican-American War. All right, who wants to take the claim in their own words here?
I'll try. So, and I'm cheating in that I've read the whole essay, so maybe some, that I know some of the things he said, so I'm just acknowledging that that's playing into my thinking right now in my restating it.
Cheat away.
It's something like, well, and I might be adding in something with this, but I'm going to try nonetheless. I can't do everything. I cannot, with my limited capacities and time on earth, address all wrongs done on this earth. It's just beyond my capacity. And so I'm trying to restate what I know in my own way, what I think Thoreau is emphasizing here. Not expressing that I agree with it, just saying that is to restating it. And so, because I can't do everything, the sphere of my ethical obligations extends to what I have agency in, or rather, those injustices that I play some sort of part in. That's where my responsibilities are, and I have to, if I'm going to be an ethical human being, separate myself from those acts of injustice, whether, certainly not do them myself, but also if they're being done by others and I'm complicit in those actions in some way, to make sure that I'm not supporting those injustices. I'd said it much longer ways.
You nailed it, though. I mean, I came up with this idea of no one's obligated to fight against every injustice, but it's like your duty to not support injustice. Back to your agency issue or notion. If you know that you doing things or not doing things are going to add to something that's going to happen that's going to be bad, and you have the power to choose to stop it or continue something else, it's your obligation to. But that doesn't mean you have to fight everything. You can. I'm thinking of Good Samaritan laws in Britain, for instance, where if you go by the road and you see someone get attacked or you see someone bleeding on the side of the road and you drive by, you can get arrested for not addressing that injustice. But I think that this claim is really just making a distinction. It's an interesting distinction, and I'd like to hear some examples that anyone has in
speaking of
mind.
examples in the spirit of personal experiences, the first, I think you guys articulated the claim really well. You can't eradicate every evil in the world, but you shouldn't participate in it. You said agency, Mitch. I like that. Like, whatever you have control over in your own life, you should not. You should make sure that you do not participate in something that is evil. So I think of, like, take climate change. It might not be our duty to eliminate climate change entirely, but that also may mean that it is our duty to ride our bike more and not participate in fossil fuel.
Right.
So maybe there's a duty there that's individual, not to eradicate the whole thing, but to do something about it. I don't know if that personal experience fits here.
I think so.
Yeah, I mean, that in a way, that's the same issue. Climate change on a global scale, and then something you can do to acknowledge climate change. I immediately came to a personal situation where maybe a friend of yours is cheating on his girlfriend. It's none of your business. Okay. Like, it's not good that he's doing it. You may be hurting him and her by not blowing the whistle. I mean, you could argue that, but still, I think that this would claim that that's not your business. However, if I'm trying to think of a condition that would make it your business, probably if you were the one that they were cheating with. I'm just I'm trying to think of a different condition with that. Maybe I ran out of gas with this example.
Well, example's sort of hard because it depends on so many different factors, and it could be that you not saying anything perpetuates it happening, but otherwise it would. And so actually you have a role in it continuing to go. And so it is your business. It's not like it's, if it's someone you care about, right? Or if it's a couple that you care about.
I could see someone arguing that for sure.
Yeah.
Bad example. Next.
Well, how about, just bullying? You could, it's not your duty to eliminate bullying.
Yeah.
I'm thinking of something that a high school student would connect with. It's not your duty to eradicate the mistreatment of people and bullying, but that does not mean you don't have a duty to resist the temptation yourself. That you can't eradicate everything, but you have agency over your own behavior to not perpetuate it.
Right. And the same thing would apply if we connect Steve's reference to the Good Samaritan idea to bullying. That in fact, if you see it happening, right, even if you're not the one doing it, then you have an obligation. Then it's like, okay, like, I don't know if you've been in this situation, you have to break up fights. And it's like, oh, I do not know these children, but you are fighting and I am going to make you not fight because you are fighting in the street. And like, sometimes that feels dangerous, but it's also like, well, what am I going to do? I'm here. You're in high school. I'm, you know, wearing a suit. So you look at me like I'm doing something different, and so I put myself between you and then you're going to stop doing it. And it's like, I think we do have that just because we're in the situation, then it is our responsibility. So I think there is something to that Good Samaritan idea that is even just running across something like even if you hear about your friend cheating on his girlfriend or whatever, as soon as then you are involved, you get involved just by like, I don't know. That's, I think, one of the problems with this quote is thinking about what is the arena for our involvement. Like,
There's
when
your
does
essential
Good,
question.
essential
Beginning
question.
of it. Where are those boundaries? How do you define involvement? Can we bring this to a societal level when we see, let's treat this issue of immigration a little bit and some of the, arrests that are being made of certain illegal immigrants in certain places under certain conditions that some people at least perceive to be unconstitutional and wrong and immoral. Are they thinking that they have to react to that? Whereas some people are saying, that's just an injustice. That may be wrong, Martha, but I'm here watching TV with you. I'm not going to go out in the streets, but I'm definitely going to tell your brother that it's wrong in Thanksgiving. I'm just trying to, where do you, I'm back to your essential question, Mitch. Where do you draw the line? What Martin Luther King said, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. He might disagree with this claim.
Well, I think he would. I think he would just because Thoreau. I mean, the beginning of the quote says it's not one's. I'm not remembering the exact wording, but to the eradication of any, even the most egregious wrong. And that one's actually really hard to stomach if you take it in a certain way. If you take it as like, well, the most egregious wrong, and
Why do you
it's like,
say
depending
that?
on what I mean by like, oh, it's not my business, right? Like, oh, I hear about it, but it's like, oh, I'm not doing it. So like Dan was saying with the example of bullying, well, if I'm not the one bullying, you know, then hands off, I don't have any obligations.
It doesn't concern me. Why would I objectify it and be bothered by it? I'm not participating in it. I've absolved myself of responsibility. Sounds a little absurd, doesn't it?
Boy, and I'm going to fall into your trap, Mitch, of knowing a little bit about Thoreau and how he separated himself from society for a long period of time and kind of wiped his hands from that connection that some people believe is just part of being human. You have your individuality, but you also are part of a social fabric. Everybody came from a mother, and you are part of something, regardless of whether or not you think you are, and you're wrapped up in them. It's not as easy to say that an injustice doesn't affect you. And I'm thinking of another quote we've done with the African proverb. Dan, remember that? I am because you are. Just the whole idea of our identities are wrapped up into other people, and it's really not fair to think of separating your involvement arbitrarily.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if we think about the immigration example that you brought up, Steve, it's like maybe people make the move of like, well, even if I've, worked with this person or like in my community in some capacity, they make the person who's like saying, oh, this is not my business, right? Says like, well, okay, they were here, but they weren't really part of my community. They reach that sort of conclusion in order to justify the position, like, well, they didn't come in the right way. And so even if I've interacted with them as a part of this community I'm in, they weren't really rightfully a part of it. And that would be a basis on which they say, okay, I don't have an obligation there. Um, but that one is a little weird. As soon as you start to think like, well, what are the boundaries with that one? Like, how long have I been, you know, uh, uh, getting this person to fix my car before I'm like, hey, what are you doing? Like, if it's 6 months, I'm like, well, okay, they just got here. If it's 5 years, I'm like, well, 5 years. If it's 35 years, am I like, well, what's going on with that? Um, yeah.
So succinctly, then, what would the counterclaim be? It's saying, this is saying, it is not a man's duty to devote. I'm going to compress it a little bit. It's not a man's duty to devote himself to the eradication of any wrong. Well, counterclaim, it is a person's duty to devote yourself to the eradication of a wrong. That is your duty, independent of how it impacts you individually or your neighbors. You have a larger obligation that you should act on, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
That's where I think Dr. Martin Luther King would land on this.
You have a duty to fight injustice. Now, anywhere, right?
Anywhere.
And some people think like this. I think it's fair to bring up the last part, though, of his quote that we haven't really focused on yet. It is his duty to wash his hands of it. So it sounds like Thoreau is saying you don't have to fight every injustice, but you do have a duty that if you feel that your silence, for instance, is going to make this injustice continue, you have a duty to speak up. So I think that maybe we could give Thoreau a little bit more credit here, in the sense that if you're an individual who sees yourself as connected to a larger social fabric, a Martin Luther King Jr., and you are going to, I'm starting to buy into this one a little bit more. Could someone pick that up?
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is not here to validate how we're talking about, but I would make an argument that he would agree with both of these, that you have a duty to eradicate evil on a large scale, and you have the duty to wash your hands of it and not participate in it.
I mean, it is hard to say like, well, we're bound up in so many networks of wrongdoing constantly. I don't know if that's your thought or your experience, but that is my experience. That I'm in all of these networks of things that I'm concerned about their ethical implications, and so there is something that's overwhelming about like even washing my hands of my own of the wrongs that I am involved in, let alone addressing those other that are that I have no hand in. Yeah.
Gosh, it just brought up another example that kind of links to the claim. When people speak of whether or not to purchase clothing that is made in countries in violation of labor laws, you could say, well, it's not my duty to eradicate that on a large scale, but I can keep my money in my pocket and not buy it and support it in that way. So I'm kind of back to what Thoreau's kind of saying here.
I see your theme in the way that you're looking at this. Yeah, you don't have to go get a plane and go to China and start investigating these factories. But you can stop buying this stuff. You definitely can. Wash your hands of it.
And maybe there's something too, like, well, what is your duty, in the sense that you really have an obligation to act in a particular sort of way? Like, this about the factory. You really, upon ethical consideration, really do feel like you can't buy from that factory. But even if it's not your duty to go fly to the factory, it's still something you could do. It's still something that it would be something that could accomplish some great good to fly to the factory. And so maybe there's a distinction there between the sorts of ethical behaviors that really it's requisite that we act upon, or that we, you know, remove ourselves from certain sorts of dynamics, and those which we can also engage in, which have value in their own right, even if they're not duties. I don't know. I think there's some folks who would strongly disagree with what I just said. I can imagine, but yeah.
I know what you mean. And again, Henry David Thoreau, the more I look at this quote, it's not a man's duty, as a matter of course, to devote himself to the eradication of any, even the most enormous wrong. But it is his duty, at least, to wash his hands of it. At the very least, Thoreau lived this, because I think he did see a society that was corrupt and was evil in a lot of different ways. And he's looking for, I don't want to get too psychological, but he needs a reason why it's okay to leave it and wash his hands of it, because he did have a sense of duty that he didn't want to get himself wrapped up in it. I'm just, again.
Right. So if slavery is the context in which he's writing this, he's saying, I'm not going to participate in slavery. I'm going to wash my hands of that terrible, immoral institution. That's what I can do.
But it's so hard, because, like, okay, even Thoreau's maybe an extreme example, because he refuses to pay his taxes, right? He's like, I'm not going to pay taxes because it's important, and some even people argue, like, oh, it wouldn't have actually gone to the federal government, the tax he didn't pay. But fine, like, let's say that it is, like, okay, signifying his allegiance to the government in some way, to pay taxes, and he refuses to do that. But, like, let's say, okay, he's growing his own apples, he's shooting his own squirrels for meat, and he's like doing whatever he does to survive. He's still probably, even if he's making his own soap or something, he's got to go to town to, like, do some stuff, right? And so, depending on, like, his judgments about that governmental entity that he is associated with, or rather, what I mean to say is, how severe are the judgments that he makes about it? How evil, how corrupt does he think that government is? Does he have an obligation not just to be like, oh, I'm going to grow my own apples and I'm not going to, like, live in town, I'm going to live at Walden, but rather to leave entirely, because he's still bound up in these networks that he's in proximity with, which are in some ways subsidizing or even acting directly to support this government.
Well said.
And you said shoot a squirrel, and I was thinking, Mitch, who made the gun?
Yeah, right, exactly. Made his own gun? No, exactly.
It is tough to get away from the benefits of living together and society fabric. Impossible, right? Come on. Yeah.
No way.
What any lingering questions that come from this? Oh,
I mean, for Thoreau, he stopped paying taxes. How evil does your government have to be before you stop paying taxes and think that that's a reasonable action? Because we're in a democracy, so there's constantly matters of debate. There's constantly things that a majority might read a particular judgment about, which differs from your judgment, and we're sort of oftentimes conceding to the will of the majority, and feeling like, well, okay, this is what people wanted and what people's general judgment about what a good policy is, and it differs from mine, and so I'm not going to refuse to pay taxes because I still respect the principle of democracy. Or there are cases when, in fact, the majority does something so heinous that you feel like it overrides your commitment to that democracy, and you're like, well, I'm not paying. I mean, taxes is just an example, whatever.
Yeah, I can't buy into this.
How do
Here's
I know? Oh,
yeah,
go ahead,
go ahead.
Steve. How do I
I
know which injustices I should try to get rid of?
when
How
is
do I
it
know which injustices I should fight against?
what's the criteria maybe? And mine was similar. It's like, when are individuals responsible for opposing injustice? What's the criteria? What's the red line?
Yeah. And I'm going to answer. I feel like I want to say always. I want to say always. And just like it matters what medium or what sort of act is involved in that opposition, and the nature of the injustice would inform what sort of act one would take in relation to that injustice. But given injustice, I think always we are called to act in response to it.
Great. You know, Mitch, before I forget, you're doing a philosophy walk on civil disobedience in Helena, Montana in a few days. Do you want to give a little preview of that? Like, what are you going to do for 3 hours with
What's a philosophy
this
walk?
community?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is with the organization.
This is a pitch for Merlin here.
Yeah. So I mentioned Merlin, the community philosophy organization I work with earlier, and so we're doing a walk on Saturday. And so I guess the preview is we're going to talk about, in general, the idea of civil disobedience, just as like a way of addressing injustice, as like an approach, because it's quite distinctive, from armed rebellion, for example. Like, okay, there's the American Revolution. They justified that revolution in relation to the British Crown based on such and such, and the context in which people have decided to utilize civil disobedience as an approach to injustice are or I guess not so much that it's different context, but rather it's a very different approach from that approach. So one is just talk about what it is in the different historical instances of it, and Thoreau is definitely one. His essay is certainly foundational on this. But then to think about, well, yeah, what do we do when there are unjust laws? When there are laws that are unjust, what do we do? Because there's a variety of different options. Thoreau says, like, well, you can just be like, well, it's not my business, so I'm just going to obey it, right? Like, I'm not deciding that. I'll I can't control it. Do you have an obligation to try to change it, right? If you feel like it's an unjust law, to do something through the typical channels to alter policy, like calling your senator, or voting, or even lobbying, or whatever, these sorts of things? Or do you have an obligation, because it is an unjust law, to transgress it right away? To be like, oh, I'm going to break that law. I'm going to support that law being broken right away because it's unjust, and my commitment is to justice over law. When those things come into competition. So I'm saying that as like some of the, and there's a variety of ways in which you could transgress those laws. One is civil disobedience. Others are, like, okay, there's a revolution and so forth. And so just that's one thing we'll be thinking about, is like, what do we do? What do we do when there are laws that are unjust? And then we'll also be thinking about some of these ethical considerations we've been weighing in relation to this quote together. Sort of what is the sphere of our ethical responsibilities in the context of a democracy? How does that alter the way in which we respond to or act upon our own judgments about right and wrong in the community we're a part of? Yeah.
That's great. That's great. And just to give a plug to Merlin, it's merlinccc.org.
You got it.
And as I understand it, Mitch, Marisa and you end up uploading a lot of different resources from these walks and events, so people can check that out if they're interested.
Yeah, there's quite an archive of different materials that Marisa has put together on the website, from different symposia that Merlin has organized, from different events that have have happened over the past decade with the organization. And there's a lot of materials also. If you're just interested in philosophy, there's some really cool materials just about some particular aspects of philosophy that I think are really cool.
Awesome. Well, Mitch, this has been a really great discussion. It's so good to see you again, and thanks again for participating in the spring in our certificate pilot. And we're looking forward to working with you on into the future. Got a lot of exciting things going on. Thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dan and Steve, for what you do. Just like the care you show for being good teachers and sort of like being in a position of advocating for something you feel like is going to be transformative to classrooms. We need that sort of care for education. It so gets thrown on the back burner of the sorts of things people are concerned about. And it's just like, oh, you just throw your child into school. And so to be deeply thinking about what's going to make education better, just thank you for being in a place to do that.
You're welcome. And Remy, my cat, decided to come up here when you talked about the philosophy walk. It was great, Mitch, though. It was a pleasure.